The sweat was already beading on my forehead before I even stepped foot inside the concrete entrance of Bunker Complex Delta 7. My chest tightened as I stared at the heavy steel door, its industrial bolts and reinforced frame looking more like a tomb entrance than a military installation. Behind me, I could hear the snickers from the other new recruits as they watched me hesitate. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Chen's having second thoughts already, someone whispered, not bothering to keep their voice down. Maybe intelligence analysis isn't for her after all. I forced myself to step forward, following Lieutenant Morrison through the entrance. The phase tunnel sloped downward into darkness, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the concrete walls that seemed to press closer with every step. My breathing became shallow, my hands clammy. The familiar panic was rising in my throat like bile. The bunker orientation was supposed to be routine. Fort Blackwood's underground intelligence facility processed classified communications from conflict zones around the world. As new intelligence analysts, we needed to familiarize ourselves with the workspace where we'd spend the next 2 years. What should have been a simple tour became my personal nightmare. The main analysis floor is 60 feet underground, Lieutenant Morrison explained as we descended deeper into the concrete maze. Complete electromagnetic shielding, climate-controlled, and designed to withstand direct nuclear impact. I tried to focus on his words instead of the walls that seemed to be closing in. The corridor stretched ahead of us, a concrete tube with no visible end. My vision started to blur around the edges. Other recruits chatted casually around me, completely unbothered by the enclosed space that was making my heart pound like a war drum. "Chen, you okay back there?" Morrison called out, noticing I'd fallen behind the group. "Fine, sir," I managed, though my voice sounded strained even to my own ears. "Just taking notes." Recruit Patterson, a cocky kid from Texas with too much confidence and too little sense, turned around with a smirk. "What's wrong, Chen? Scared of a little underground tour? Wait until you see the emergency bunkers. They're even smaller." The laughter that followed felt like acid in my ears. I wanted to explain that it wasn't fear, not exactly. It was something deeper, more primal. Ever since I was a child, enclosed spaces had triggered something in my brain that I couldn't control. My therapist back home had called it severe claustrophobia. But that clinical term didn't capture the absolute terror that gripped me when I felt trapped. We reached the main analysis floor, a vast underground chamber filled with computer workstations and communications equipment. The space opened up enough that I could finally breathe again, though the knowledge that we were still buried under tons of concrete and earth kept my anxiety simmering just below the surface. "This is where you'll be working," Morrison announced. "Analyzing intercepted communications, tracking enemy movements, identifying threats before they materialize. The work you do here saves lives in the field." I found an empty workstation and tried to focus on the equipment demonstration. The computers were state-of-the-art, the communication arrays more sophisticated than anything I'd seen during my linguistics training at Georgetown. This was exactly the kind of work I'd dreamed of doing, using my language skills and pattern recognition abilities to support military operations overseas. But every few minutes, my eyes would drift to the concrete ceiling above us, calculating the weight of earth and stone pressing down. The emergency exit seemed impossibly far away. What if there was a cave-in? What if the ventilation system failed? What if we were trapped down here? "Chen, pay attention," Morrison's sharp voice cut through my spiraling thoughts. "This equipment is classified. You need to understand every component." "Yes, sir." I forced myself to focus on the demonstration, taking detailed notes about encryption protocols and communication frequencies. My handwriting was shaky, but the information was solid. I'd always been good at compartmentalizing, at pushing through discomfort when the mission required it. After 3 hours underground, we finally emerged into daylight. I practically stumbled out of the bunker entrance, gasping fresh air like I'd been drowning. Several recruits noticed my obvious relief and exchanged knowing glances. "Rough day in the hole, Chen?" Patterson drawled. "You looked like you were about to pass out down there." "I'm fine," I said curtly, straightening my uniform and trying to regain some composure. "Sure you are," another recruit, Williams, chimed in. "Hope you don't have to work any double shifts down there. Might be too much for your delicate constitution." That evening in the barracks, the whispers followed me everywhere. Word had spread quickly about my obvious distress in the bunker. I overheard fragments of conversations as I passed by groups of recruits. Heard Chen can't handle underground assignments. How'd she even make it through basic training? Intelligence course isn't for everyone, I guess. I lay in my bunk that night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. My language skills were exceptional. I'd scored in the top percentile on every aptitude test, and my professors at Georgetown had recommended me personally for this position. But none of that mattered if I couldn't function in the environment where the work actually happened. The next morning brought a new humiliation. Captain Rodriguez, the head of our training program, called me into his office. His expression was serious as he gestured for me to sit down. "Chen, I've received some concerning reports about yesterday's bunker orientation," he began. "Lieutenant Morrison noted that you seem to have difficulty with the underground environment." "Sir, I was just adjusting to the new workspace." "It won't be a problem." Rodriguez studied me carefully. "The nature of intelligence work often requires extended periods in secure underground facilities. If you have medical or psychological conditions that would impair your ability to function in that environment, we need to know now." I felt my career slipping away before it had even begun. "Sir, I can handle the assignment. Yesterday was just an adjustment period." "I hope so, Chen, because your test scores indicate exceptional potential. But potential means nothing if you can't perform when it matters." He leaned back in his chair. "I'm assigning you to surface communications for now, monitoring radio traffic from the above-ground facility. We'll reassess your underground readiness in a few weeks." Surface communications was where they put analysts who couldn't handle the real work. I knew it, Rodriguez knew it, and within hours, every recruit in the program knew it too. I'd been relegated to the minor leagues before I'd even had a chance to prove myself. For the next month, I worked alone in a small communications room on the second floor of the administration building, monitoring routine radio chatter and filing reports that probably went straight into a forgotten filing cabinet. My colleagues were 60 feet below, doing the meaningful work of tracking enemy communications and identifying security threats. I was reduced to transcribing routine supply requests and weather reports. The isolation was almost worse than the claustrophobia. During meals in the cafeteria, conversations would stop when I approached. Other analysts would make jokes about surface dwellers and bunker allergies. Patterson had started calling me Topside Chen, a nickname that spread through the training program like wildfire. But isolation has its advantages. While my colleagues were focused on their underground assignments, I had access to communication channels they never monitored. Surface radio traffic included not just routine military communications, but intercepted civilian frequencies, emergency broadcasts, and sometimes, if conditions were right, enemy transmissions that bounced off the atmosphere in unexpected ways. It was during one of these lonely night shifts that I first noticed the pattern. Hidden in the routine radio chatter, disguised as weather reports and supply requests, were coded messages that followed a structure I recognized from my linguistics. Training. Someone was using the standard military communication network to pass information to unauthorized recipients. I spent 3 sleepless nights documenting the pattern, cross-referencing transmission times with operational schedules, tracking the subtle variations in phrasing that indicated coded intelligence. What I discovered made my blood run cold. Someone with access to classified information was feeding real-time operational details to enemy forces overseas. The revelation should have been my moment of vindication, proof that my surface assignment had value after all. But when I tried to report my findings to Captain Rodriguez, I was met with skepticism and dismissal. "Chen, you're analyzing routine communications. These patterns you think you see are probably just coincidence." "Sir, with respect, I've run statistical analysis on the frequency patterns. The probability of coincidence is less than 1%. Rodriguez barely glanced at my detailed report. "Your job is to monitor and transcribe, not to conduct unauthorized intelligence analysis. Stick to your assigned duties." I left his office feeling more isolated than ever. The other analysts viewed me as a washout who couldn't handle bunker duty. Command viewed me as an overreaching surface operator who was trying to justify her assignment by seeing threats that didn't exist. But I knew what I'd found was real, and I knew that if I was right, operational teams overseas were walking into traps. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of filing my routine reports and going to bed, I stayed at my workstation and continued tracking the coded transmissions. If no one would listen to my analysis, I'd have to gather evidence so compelling that it couldn't be ignored. What I discovered over the next week made my previous findings look trivial. The coded messages weren't just passing along routine intelligence. They were providing real-time updates on troop movements, mission timelines, and operational objectives. Someone with high-level access was systematically betraying every classified operation that crossed their desk. But just as I was preparing to present my evidence, everything changed. The base alarm system activated at 3 in the morning, jarring me awake with its urgent wail. Emergency lights flooded the corridors as personnel scrambled to their assigned positions. "All intelligence personnel report to emergency stations immediately," the intercom crackled. "This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." I threw on my uniform and rushed to the communication center, my heart pounding with adrenaline rather than claustrophobia for once. Captain Rodriguez was already there, his face grim as he reviewed incoming reports. "What's the situation, sir?" I asked. "Special Operations Team is pinned down overseas," he said without looking up. "They walked into an ambush that shouldn't have been possible. Enemy forces were waiting in exactly the right positions, with exactly the right equipment to counter our team's approach." My blood turned to ice. This was exactly what my analysis had predicted. The coded transmissions I'd been tracking had warned that something like this would happen. But before I could say anything, Rodriguez continued. "We've lost communication with the team. Last transmission indicated they'd taken refuge in an abandoned tunnel complex, but we have no way to reach them. Standard rescue operations are impossible due to enemy air superiority in the area. What about alternative communication methods?" I asked. "The tunnel system they're hiding in extends for miles underground. It's an old smuggling network that predates satellite communication. We can't reach them with conventional signals." As Rodriguez outlined the hopeless situation, an idea began forming in my mind. It was insane, dangerous, and probably impossible. But it might be the only chance those soldiers had. The same tunnel complex that was hiding our trapped team from enemy detection was also what made conventional rescue impossible. But someone with the right equipment and the right knowledge might be able to reach them through unconventional means. Someone who understood communication systems and enemy patterns. Someone who had been tracking the intelligence leak that had caused this disaster in the first place. Someone who was about to discover that her greatest weakness might actually be her most valuable strength. The idea that formed in my mind was so audacious that I almost dismissed it immediately. But as I stood in the emergency communication center, watching Rodriguez coordinate a rescue operation that everyone knew was doomed to fail, I realized that conventional solutions weren't going to save those soldiers. Sir, I said, stepping forward despite knowing I was about to end my career. I need to brief you on the intelligence leak I've been tracking. Rodriguez barely glanced at me. Chen, not now. We have an active emergency situation. This is directly related to the emergency, sir. The ambush those soldiers walked into wasn't random. I've documented a pattern of coded transmissions that have been feeding operational intelligence to enemy forces for weeks. That got his attention. Rodriguez stopped what he was doing and fixed me with a hard stare. What are you talking about? I pulled out the analysis I'd been compiling, spreading the documentation across his desk. These transmissions have been hiding in routine military communications, weather reports, supply requests, maintenance schedules. But they're actually coded intelligence updates, providing real-time information about our operations overseas. Rodriguez studied the papers, his expression shifting from irritation to concern as he processed what I was showing him. How long have you been tracking this? 3 weeks, sir. I tried to report it before, but I told you to stick to routine monitoring. Rodriguez's jaw tightened as he reviewed my evidence. The pattern you've identified here, if it's accurate, would explain how enemy forces have been anticipating our movements. It gets worse, sir. Based on the transmission schedule, I believe the next coded message will go out within the next 6 hours. It will contain the exact location where our trapped team is hiding. The implication hit Rodriguez like a physical blow. They'll be slaughtered unless we can reach them first and either extract them or provide them with actionable intelligence about enemy positions. I took a deep breath, knowing what I was about to propose would sound insane. Sir, I have an idea, but it involves unconventional methods. Rodriguez gestured for me to continue, his full attention now focused on what I was saying. The tunnel system where our team is trapped extends for miles in multiple directions. It's an old smuggling network with connections that reach almost to the border. If someone could navigate those tunnels and reach our team with communication equipment, they could establish contact and coordinate either an extraction or a counter-ambush. Navigate those tunnels how? We don't have detailed maps, and the enemy controls the surface access points. I pulled out a topographical survey I'd found in the base archives. This survey was conducted 15 years ago by Army Corps of Engineers. It shows the tunnel layout in detail, including secondary entrances that are miles away from the current combat zone. Someone could enter here. I pointed to a location marked on the map, and follow this route to reach our team's position. Rodriguez studied the map, his expression growing more skeptical by the moment. Chen, you're talking about crawling through miles of underground tunnels with no backup, no communication, and no guarantee that the route is still passable. It's suicide. It's the only option that doesn't involve waiting for those soldiers to be discovered and killed. Even if someone was crazy enough to attempt this, who would we send? Our special operations personnel are either deployed or tied up with the current emergency. We don't have anyone with the technical expertise to carry portable communication equipment through that kind of terrain. The words hung in the air between us. We both knew there was only one person in the facility who had the technical communication skills required for the mission. The same person who had been relegated to surface duty because she couldn't handle underground environments. I'll go, I said quietly. Rodriguez stared at me as if I'd lost my mind. Chen, you can't even handle bunker duty without panic attacks. You're talking about crawling through enemy tunnel systems for hours. I know the communication systems better than anyone else on base. I've been tracking enemy patterns for weeks. And I'm the only person here who doesn't have critical duties in the current emergency operation. You're also the person who nearly passed out during a routine bunker tour. I met his gaze steadily. Those soldiers are going to die if someone doesn't try. My personal limitations are irrelevant compared to that. Rodriguez was quiet for several minutes, weighing impossible options. Finally, he spoke. Even if I was insane enough to authorize this, The tunnel entrance is in territory that's crawling with enemy patrols. How would you even reach the starting point? Night insertion via helicopter, 1 mile from the entrance. I hike to the tunnel access point and enter before dawn. By the time enemy patrols are active, I'll be underground and invisible. And if the tunnels have collapsed, if the route is blocked, if you get lost down there, then I die attempting something instead of doing nothing while our people get slaughtered. The stark honesty of my answer seemed to hit Rodriguez harder than any argument I could have made. He looked at the intelligence reports scattered across his desk, then at the map showing the tunnel system, then back at me. Chen, what you're proposing isn't just dangerous. It's almost certainly impossible. These tunnels were used by smugglers decades ago. They could be flooded, collapsed, or booby-trapped. You could get lost down there and never be found. Sir, with respect, those are acceptable risks given the alternative. Rodriguez activated his secure communication system and spent the next 20 minutes conferring with higher command. I could hear fragments of the conversation, most of it focused on the lack of viable alternatives for reaching the trapped team. Conventional rescue was impossible due to enemy air superiority. Waiting for reinforcements would take too long. The intelligence leak meant that enemy forces would locate and eliminate our team within hours. When Rodriguez finished his calls, his expression was grim. Command has authorized your mission, but with significant modifications. You'll carry emergency beacon equipment so we can track your progress. You'll have a 12-hour window to reach our team and establish communication. If you haven't made contact by then, we abort the operation. Understood, sir. Chen, I need you to understand something. Once you enter those tunnels, you'll be completely on your own. We can't provide backup, we can't extract you if something goes wrong, and we can't even communicate with you until you reach our team's position. If you have any doubts about your ability to handle extended time in underground confined spaces, this is your last chance to reconsider. I thought about the month I'd spent in isolation, monitoring surface communications while my colleagues did meaningful work underground. I thought about the coded transmissions I'd discovered and the lives that would be lost if the intelligence leak continued. I thought about the soldiers trapped in those tunnels, counting on someone to save them before enemy forces closed in. I can handle it, sir. Rodriguez nodded slowly. Equipment prep starts now. You leave in 3 hours. The next 3 hours passed in a blur of preparation that felt surreal. I was fitted with lightweight combat gear designed for tunnel operations. The communication equipment I'd carry was the most sophisticated portable system on the base, capable of establishing satellite uplink from virtually any location. The tunnel map was memorized and then destroyed for security purposes, but the most challenging preparation was psychological. I spent an hour in the base's smallest storage closet, forcing myself to remain calm in an enclosed space while visualizing the tunnel mission ahead. The panic still came in waves, but I found that focusing on the technical aspects of the communication equipment helped me maintain control. Sergeant Torres, the base's survival specialist, briefed me on tunnel navigation techniques. Keep your breathing steady and shallow to conserve oxygen. Mark your route with chalk at every intersection so you can find your way back if necessary. If you encounter standing water, test the depth carefully before proceeding. How will I know when I've reached the area where our team is located? These old smuggling tunnels have distinctive acoustic properties. You'll be able to hear voices or movement from several hundred yards away. But that also means anyone else in the tunnels will be able to hear you. As departure time approached, word of my mission spread through the base despite official secrecy. Protocols. The same colleagues who had spent weeks mocking my surface assignment were now watching me prepare for an operation that none of them would attempt. The whispered conversations followed me everywhere, but the tone had changed completely. Heard Chen's going into the tunnels to reach the trapped team. Didn't she nearly panic during bunker orientation? That's what makes this so crazy. She can barely handle being underground, but she's volunteering for a mission that involves crawling through enemy tunnel systems for hours. Patterson, who had coined the nickname Topside Chen, approached me as I finished my equipment check. "Chen, I owe you an apology. What you said about the intelligence patterns, about the coded transmissions. Command confirmed you were right. If you hadn't been tracking those signals, our team would have walked into even more ambushes." "The mission isn't over yet," I replied, adjusting my communication pack. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," he said quietly. "We all know you've got more guts than sense." At exactly 0200 hours, I climbed into the helicopter that would take me to the insertion point. The flight was 30 minutes of darkness and engine noise, time that I used to run through communication protocols and tunnel navigation procedures one final time. But as we approached the drop zone, a different kind of preparation took over. I was about to spend the next 6 to 12 hours crawling through underground passages that would make the base bunker look spacious by comparison. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to abort the mission, to find any excuse to avoid the enclosed spaces that had terrorized me since childhood. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But somewhere in those tunnels, American soldiers were trapped and waiting for rescue. They didn't know that help was coming, and they didn't know that their salvation depended on someone who was afraid of the very environment where they were hiding. The helicopter touched down in a clearing 1 mile from the tunnel entrance. I gathered my equipment, checked my compass bearing, and began the hike that would take me to the most challenging mission of my career. Behind me, the helicopter disappeared into the darkness, taking with it my last connection to safety and support. Ahead of me lay enemy territory, unknown dangers, and a tunnel system that would test every limit of my psychological endurance. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be. The tunnel entrance was exactly where the 15-year-old survey had indicated, hidden behind a collapsed stone wall that had been carefully arranged to look natural. I used my tactical knife to clear away debris, revealing an opening barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The darkness beyond was absolute, swallowing my flashlight beam after only a few feet. Standing at the threshold, I felt the familiar tightness in my chest beginning to build. The opening looked like a mouth ready to swallow me whole. Every rational part of my mind was screaming warnings about confined spaces, structural instability, and the dozen ways I could die in the underground maze ahead. But somewhere beyond that darkness, soldiers were counting on someone to reach them before enemy forces closed in. I activated my emergency beacon so base could track my initial progress, then squeezed through the entrance. The tunnel immediately narrowed, forcing me to crawl on my hands and knees across rough stone that scraped through my tactical gloves. The walls pressed in from both sides, and the ceiling was low enough that I had to keep my head down to avoid scraping against jagged rock formations. The first hour was pure psychological torture. Every few yards, I had to stop and control my breathing as panic threatened to overwhelm me. The tunnel twisted and turned unpredictably, sometimes opening into chambers large enough to stand in, other times narrowing so much that I had to remove my communication pack and push it ahead of me while squirming through gaps that barely accommodated my body. But something unexpected began happening as I moved deeper into the tunnel system. The terror that had dominated my thoughts started to give way to a different kind of focus. In the absolute darkness, with only my flashlight creating a small circle of visibility, the outside world ceased to exist. There were no distractions, no colleagues watching for signs of weakness, no commanders questioning my capabilities. There was only the immediate challenge of navigation and the technical precision required to move efficiently through the underground maze. I reached the first major intersection according to my memorized map and paused to mark my route with chalk. The communication equipment on my back was functioning perfectly, its diagnostic lights indicating strong signal potential once I reached sufficient depth to avoid surface interference. My breathing had steadied into the shallow, controlled pattern that Sergeant Torres had taught me for conserving oxygen in confined spaces. The second hour brought new challenges. I encountered my first flooded section, a stretch of tunnel where groundwater had accumulated to a depth of nearly 3 feet. Testing carefully with my tactical knife, I determined that the water was flowing rather than stagnant, which meant the tunnel continued beyond the flooded area. I sealed my communication equipment in waterproof covers and waded through the section, the cold water soaking through my gear and making every movement more difficult. Beyond the flooded area, the tunnel branched into 3 different passages. According to my memorized map, the middle passage would take me directly toward the area where our trap team was located, but it was also the most difficult route, requiring a descent through a series of narrow vertical shafts that the original smugglers had used to move between different levels of the tunnel system. I chose the middle passage and immediately understood why it had been avoided by casual users of the tunnel network. The vertical shafts were barely wide enough for a single person, with handholds carved into the rock that were worn smooth by decades of use. Descending with a full equipment pack required careful planning and precise movements. One mistake would result in a fall that could break bones or damage the communication equipment that was essential to the mission's success. The third hour took me deeper into the tunnel system than I had ever been underground. The rock formations changed, becoming older and more stable, which meant less risk of collapse but also more complex navigation as the tunnels followed natural cave formations rather than deliberately excavated passages. I began to hear sounds that weren't coming from my own movement, distant echoes that could have been water dripping or air moving through distant passages. But then I heard something that made me stop completely. Voices, faint but definitely human, coming from somewhere ahead and to my left. I extinguished my flashlight and listened carefully in the absolute darkness. The voices were speaking English with American accents, discussing ammunition counts and defensive positions. I had found them. Moving toward the voices required abandoning the main tunnel and following a narrow side passage that forced me to crawl on my belly for nearly 200 yards. The communication pack scraped against the tunnel ceiling with every movement, and several times I had to back up and find alternate routes around obstacles that blocked the passage completely. The voices grew clearer as I approached. I could make out individual words and recognize the tactical terminology of soldiers discussing their defensive situation. They were alive, they were organized, and they were preparing for a fight that they probably couldn't win without outside support. The passage I was following opened into a natural cave chamber where 6 soldiers had established a defensive position. They were dirty, exhausted, and obviously surprised when I emerged from a tunnel opening they hadn't even noticed existed. "Identify yourself," the team leader commanded, raising his weapon but not pointing it directly at me. "Staff Sergeant Chen, Fort Blackwood Intelligence Division," I replied, keeping my hands visible. "I'm here to establish communication with your command and coordinate extraction or support." The team leader, who identified himself as Captain Morrison, looked at me as if I was a hallucination. "How did you get here?" "We've been trapped for 18 hours with no contact with base. I came through the old smuggling tunnels. I have portable communication equipment that can establish satellite contact with Fort Blackwood." I began unpacking the communication array, setting up the antenna and signal amplification equipment in the chamber. "You came through those tunnels alone?" one of the soldiers asked, staring at the narrow opening I had emerged from. "That passage looks like it goes on for miles." "About 6 hours of crawling," I confirmed, activating the communication system. "But we don't have much time. Intelligence indicates that enemy forces have been receiving real-time updates about your position." They'll be moving to surround this cave system within the next few hours. The communication equipment established contact with Fort Blackwood. On the first attempt, the digital display showing strong signal strength despite our underground location. Captain Rodriguez's voice came through clearly when I activated the voice channel. "Base, this is Chen. I've reached the trap team and established communication. 6 personnel, no serious injuries, but enemy forces are expected to converge. On this position soon. Outstanding work, Chen. Stand by for tactical update." What followed was a rapid coordination session that transformed our desperate situation into a strategic opportunity. The intelligence I had gathered about enemy communication patterns, combined with the team's knowledge of local terrain and the communication capabilities I had brought with me, created possibilities that hadn't existed before. Captain Morrison's team had been monitoring enemy radio traffic and had identified the locations of several equipment caches that enemy forces were using to coordinate their search operations. With real-time communication to base, we could coordinate precise airstrikes on those positions while the team moved to a more defensible location using tunnel routes that enemy forces didn't know existed. But the plan required someone to guide the team through tunnel passages that were even more challenging than the route I had used to reach them. Some of the passages were so narrow that equipment would have to be passed through separately from personnel. Other sections required technical climbing skills to navigate vertical shafts with heavy gear. "Chen, can you lead us through those tunnels?" Captain Morrison asked. I looked at the soldiers who were depending on me, then at the tunnel opening. That represented our only route to safety. The passage ahead would be the most challenging underground navigation I had ever attempted, complicated by the need to guide 6 other people through spaces that had tested my limits when I was moving. "Alone?" "Yes, sir, but we need to move now. Once enemy forces realize we've disappeared from this position, they'll start searching the tunnel entrances." The next hour was the longest of my life. Leading the team through the tunnel system required constant communication, careful coordination, and precise timing to move equipment through the most restrictive passages. I had to overcome not just my own claustrophobia, but help team members who had never experienced extended underground movement to manage their own psychological responses to the confined spaces. When we encountered the flooded section that I had waded through earlier, I had to guide each team member individually through the process of waterproofing their equipment and navigating the submerged passage safely. When we reached the vertical shafts, I established rope systems and coached team members through climbing techniques that allowed them to move their gear safely between different levels of the tunnel system. But something remarkable had happened. During those hours underground, the claustrophobia that had dominated my thoughts for years had been replaced by a different kind of awareness. In the absolute focus required for technical navigation and team coordination, I had discovered that confined spaces could provide clarity rather than terror when approached with the right mindset and sufficient purpose. We emerged from the tunnel system at a concealed exit point 3 miles from where the team had originally been trapped. Coordinated airstrikes had eliminated the enemy equipment caches while we were underground, and extraction helicopters were waiting at a secure landing zone that we could reach without crossing areas controlled by hostile forces. As we boarded the extraction helicopter, Captain Morrison turned to me with an expression of genuine respect. "Chen, I don't know how you managed to navigate those tunnels, but you saved 6 lives tonight. Just doing my job, sir." But even as I said it, I knew that something fundamental had changed. The same confined spaces that had triggered panic attacks during routine bunker tours had become the environment where I had accomplished the most important mission of my career. My greatest weakness had somehow transformed into my most valuable capability. The flight back to Fort Blackwood gave me time to process what had happened. For years, I had seen my claustrophobia as a limitation that prevented me from reaching my full potential as an intelligence analyst. But in the tunnels, That same sensitivity to enclosed spaces had translated into exceptional awareness of spatial relationships, structural stability, and navigation challenges that would have defeated most people. As we approached the base, I could see the lights of Bunker Complex, Delta 7, where my colleagues were continuing their important work 60 feet underground. Tomorrow I would return to that facility, but not as someone who couldn't handle underground assignments. I would return as the person who had proven that sometimes the greatest strengths emerge from what we perceive as our greatest weaknesses. The debriefing room at Fort Blackwood felt different when I walked in 12 hours after the extraction. The same fluorescent lights, the same gray walls, the same metal table where I had sat countless times, receiving assignments that others deemed suitable for someone with my limitations. But everything had changed, including the way people looked at me. General Harrison sat across from me, flanked by Colonel Rodriguez and a woman I didn't recognize wearing civilian clothes with the bearing of someone from a 3-letter agency. My mission report lay open on the table between us, 27 pages of detailed documentation covering everything from tunnel navigation, techniques to communication protocols, to the intelligence patterns that had led to the ambush in the first place. Sergeant Chen, General Harrison began, before we discuss your future assignments, I want to address the intelligence leak you identified. Your analysis led to the arrest of Major Kellerman from the Pentagon Intelligence Division. He had been selling operational details to foreign contacts for 8 months. The woman in civilian clothes leaned forward. Your pattern recognition work was exceptional. The coded transmissions you tracked saved not just the 6 soldiers you rescued, but potentially dozens of other operations that would have been compromised by continued intelligence breaches. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. Ma'am, the patterns were there for anyone to see if they had access to the right communication channels. That's precisely the point, she replied. You had access to those channels because you were assigned to surface monitoring duty. An assignment that was given to you because command believed you couldn't handle underground operations. General. Harrison cleared his throat. Chen, we owe you an apology. Your capabilities were misjudged based on a single incident during orientation. Your recent performance demonstrates that we've been wasting your talents. Sir, I wouldn't characterize it as wasted time. The surface monitoring assignment provided the perspective necessary to identify the intelligence leak. Colonel Rodriguez consulted his notes. Chen, during your tunnel operation, you spent over 6 hours navigating underground passages that our engineering estimates suggest should have been impassable for someone carrying communication equipment. How did you manage that level of underground mobility? I considered how to explain something I didn't fully understand myself. Sir, the confined spaces that initially caused anxiety became manageable when approached as technical navigation challenges. The same spatial awareness that made bunkers feel threatening translated into advantages for tunnel movement. The civilian woman made notes on her tablet. Have you considered that your claustrophobia might actually be hypersensitivity to spatial relationships rather than a phobia in the traditional sense? Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand the distinction. People with exceptional spatial intelligence often experience standard, enclosed spaces as overwhelming because they're processing far more environmental information than most people. In complex navigation situations, that same hypersensitivity becomes a strategic advantage. General Harrison leaned back in his chair. Regardless of the psychological mechanisms involved, the results speak for themselves. You successfully completed a mission that our best estimates suggested was impossible. Over the following days, word of the tunnel rescue spread through Fort Blackwood and beyond. The story took on a life of its own as it passed through the military communication network. Details became exaggerated, timelines compressed, and my role expanded until I barely recognized the mission in the versions that came back to me through informal channels. Patterson approached me in the cafeteria. 3 days after my return. Chen, I heard you spent 12 hours crawling through enemy tunnel systems to rescue an entire platoon. It was 6 hours and 6 soldiers, I corrected. Still, that's incredible. How did you manage to stay calm in those confined spaces for so long? I stirred my coffee while considering how to answer. I discovered that claustrophobia isn't necessarily about the spaces themselves. It's about feeling trapped without purpose. When the mission required tunnel navigation, the spaces became tools rather than obstacles. He shook his head in amazement. Man, I feel terrible about how we treated you during orientation. Calling you topside chin and making jokes about bunker allergies. Patterson, you reacted to what you observed. My response to the bunker environment was genuinely problematic at the time, but you overcame it. I found a different way to approach it. The conversation was interrupted by Sergeant Torres, who had conducted my pre-mission briefing on tunnel navigation techniques. Chen, I've been reviewing your mission report. Your underground movement times are exceptional. Have you considered specialized training in subterranean operations? What kind of training? Cave rescue, underground reconnaissance, technical climbing in confined spaces. There's a growing need for personnel who can operate effectively in tunnel environments. Counterterrorism, hostage rescue, intelligence gathering in areas where conventional forces can't penetrate. The idea intrigued me more than I expected. Would that involve regular underground operations? Almost exclusively. You'd be working in environments that most people couldn't psychologically handle. Mine shafts, natural cave systems, urban tunnel networks, underground facilities. Anywhere that standard military operations can't reach. That evening I found myself in an unusual position. Instead of dreading my next assignment to the underground bunker complex, I was looking forward to it. The same Delta 7 facility that had triggered panic attacks during orientation now felt like familiar territory. I volunteered for a double shift, spending 14 hours in the communication center analyzing intercepted transmissions and coordinating. With overseas operations, the work felt different now. Instead of fighting against the enclosed environment, I found myself appreciating the focused atmosphere that underground facilities provided. The elimination of external distractions allowed for deeper concentration on complex analysis tasks. The acoustic properties of the bunker made it easier to distinguish subtle audio patterns in intercepted communications. Williams, one of my colleagues from the orientation program, noticed the change immediately. Chen, you seem completely comfortable. Down here now, what changed? I learned that comfort isn't about the environment. It's about having the right tools and the right purpose for dealing with whatever environment you're in. But you nearly panicked during the first bunker tour. Because I was approaching it as a space that was constraining me rather than a space that was enabling specific types of work. The next week brought an unexpected visitor to Fort Blackwood. Colonel Jennifer Reyes from Special Operations Command arrived with a proposal that would reshape my entire career trajectory. Sergeant Chen, I've reviewed your tunnel rescue operation and your ongoing intelligence analysis work. I'm here to offer you specialized training with the Underground Operations Division. I had never heard of the Underground Operations Division, which Colonel Reyes explained was a classified program that developed personnel and techniques for missions in subterranean environments. Cave systems, urban tunnel networks, underground facilities, mine complexes, any environment where conventional military operations can't function effectively. We need people who can navigate these spaces, establish communications, conduct reconnaissance, and coordinate rescue operations. What would the training involve? 6 months of intensive preparation. Technical climbing, underground navigation, confined space psychology, specialized communication systems, emergency medical procedures adapted for tunnel environments. You'd be working with equipment and techniques that don't exist anywhere else in the military. The opportunity was exactly what I hadn't known I was looking for. Colonel, what made you consider me for this program? Your recent mission demonstrated capabilities that we've been trying to develop in other personnel for years. Most people can be trained in the technical aspects of underground operations, but the psychological component is much more difficult. You've already proven that you can function effectively in environments that would incapacitate most operators. Are you saying my claustrophobia is actually an advantage? Colonel Reyes smiled. I'm saying that what you call claustrophobia might be exceptional environmental awareness that most people don't possess. In underground operations, that level of spatial sensitivity is invaluable. The training program that followed was the most challenging and rewarding experience of my military career. I learned to navigate cave systems that extended for miles underground, establish communication networks in environments where radio signals couldn't penetrate, and coordinate complex rescue operations in spaces where conventional tactics didn't apply. But more importantly, I learned that my relationship with confined spaces had been transformed permanently. What had once triggered panic attacks now provided a sense of focused capability. Underground environments became my professional specialty rather than my personal limitation. 6 months later, I graduated from the Underground Operations Program with qualifications in cave rescue, subterranean reconnaissance, and confined space communications. My first assignment took me to overseas locations where I provided support for operations that required underground access capabilities. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same claustrophobia that had nearly ended my military career during bunker orientation had become the foundation for specialized skills that were needed in missions around the world. The anxiety that had made me feel weak and limited had evolved into hyper-awareness that made me exceptionally capable in environments where most people couldn't function. But the most significant change wasn't professional. It was personal. I had learned that psychological challenges aren't necessarily weaknesses to overcome. Sometimes they're capabilities that haven't found the right application yet. The key is recognizing when something that appears to be a limitation might actually be a strength waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. Standing in the graduation ceremony, receiving commendations for exceptional performance in underground operations training, I thought about the frightened analyst who had nearly passed out during a routine bunker tour less than a year earlier. That person hadn't been weak or incapable. She had simply been in the wrong environment for her particular set of abilities. Now when I received assignments that required crawling through underground tunnel systems for hours at a time, establishing communications in environments that challenged every conventional approach, or navigating cave complexes that existed nowhere on official maps, I approached them with confidence rather than dread. The woman who had been too claustrophobic for bunkers had become the specialist they called when underground operations required someone who could handle what others couldn't. And in that transformation, I had discovered that our greatest challenges often contain the seeds of our most valuable capabilities. 2 years into my specialized career with the Underground Operations Division, I received the assignment that would define everything I had become. The call came at 03:00 hours on a Tuesday morning, jolting me awake in my quarters at the division's training facility in Colorado. Colonel Reyes's voice was tense with urgency as she briefed me on a situation that had been developing for the past 18 hours. Chen, we have a hostage situation in Eastern Europe. 12 American contractors are being held in an abandoned Soviet-era mining complex. The facility extends nearly a mile underground through a network of interconnected tunnels and chambers. Surface assault is impossible due to the structural instability of the complex, and conventional rescue operations can't penetrate the underground portions where the hostages are being held. I was already reaching for my equipment bag as she continued the briefing. The mining complex has been abandoned for 30 years. Most of the tunnels are partially flooded, and there's significant risk of collapse if heavy equipment or large teams attempt to enter. We need someone who can navigate the underground portions alone, locate the hostages, and either facilitate extraction or establish communication for negotiation purposes. Timeline, ma'am? Intelligence indicates the hostage takers are planning to move the prisoners within 48 hours. Once they relocate to a different facility, we lose our window for underground access. This is our only opportunity. The mission briefing that followed was unlike anything I had encountered during my specialized training. The Soviet mining complex was a labyrinth of interconnected passages that had been excavated over several decades using techniques that prioritized ore extraction over structural safety. The tunnels followed mineral veins through unstable rock formations, creating a three-dimensional maze with multiple levels, connected by vertical shafts that varied dramatically in size and accessibility. Intelligence had provided detailed architectural plans from the facility's operational period, but 30 years of abandonment meant that significant portions of the tunnel system could be flooded, collapsed, or otherwise impassable. My mission would require real-time navigation decisions based on conditions that couldn't be predicted from surface reconnaissance. The hostages are being held in what used to be the main processing chamber, approximately half a mile underground and accessible only through a series of narrow access tunnels that were originally designed for equipment maintenance rather than human passage, Colonel Reyes explained as we reviewed the facility schematics. Your job is to reach that chamber, assess the situation, and establish communication with our command center so we can coordinate either rescue or negotiation. What about the hostage takers? How many personnel are we dealing with? Estimated 8 to 12 individuals, all armed, with at least 2 positioned as sentries in the upper levels of the complex. They're using the underground location specifically because they know conventional military response can't reach them there. The equipment I would carry was the most sophisticated underground operation gear that had ever been developed. Lightweight communication arrays capable of penetrating rock and earth to maintain contact with surface operations. Specialized navigation. Equipment that could function in environments where GPS signals couldn't penetrate. Emergency medical supplies adapted for confined space rescue operations. And climbing gear designed specifically for the variable conditions found in abandoned mining complexes. But the most critical equipment was psychological. Over 2 years of intensive training, I had learned to transform claustrophobic responses into heightened environmental awareness. The anxiety that had once made underground spaces feel threatening now translated into exceptional sensitivity to structural stability, air quality, acoustic properties, and spatial relationships that most people couldn't perceive. The insertion would be conducted under cover of darkness, with helicopter transport to a location 3 miles from the mining complex. From there, I would approach on foot, locate one of several abandoned entrance shafts that connected to the main tunnel system, and begin the underground navigation to reach the hostage location. Chen, I need to emphasize the risks involved in this mission, Colonel Reyes said as we completed the equipment preparation. This isn't just about confined spaces or technical navigation. You'll be operating alone in a structurally unstable environment while avoiding detection by armed hostage takers who will kill you if they discover your presence. If something goes wrong, we can't extract you. Understood, ma'am. What's the communication protocol once I'm underground? You'll carry emergency beacon equipment that will allow us to track your general location. But voice communication will be impossible until you reach sufficient depth to establish satellite uplink through the communication array. Once you make contact with our command center, we can coordinate whatever response is appropriate based on the situation you find. The helicopter flight to the insertion point took 4 hours through mountainous terrain that looked hostile. Even from the air, dense forests, rocky outcroppings, and deep valleys created a landscape where someone could disappear completely if they made a single navigation error. As we approached the drop zone, I reviewed the underground route one final time. memorizing the complex three-dimensional path that would take me through the mining complex to reach the hostage location. The insertion itself was routine, but the approach to the mining complex tested every stealth technique I had learned during specialized training. The facility was located in a valley surrounded by high ridges that provided excellent observation positions for sentries. I had to assume that the hostage takers were monitoring all surface approaches using night vision equipment and motion sensors. Moving through the dense forest that surrounded the mining complex required 3 hours of careful progress, stopping frequently to observe and listen for any indication of sentry positions or patrol activities. The abandoned facility gradually became visible through the trees, a collection of deteriorating concrete structures and rusted equipment that looked like the remnants of industrial civilization. The entrance shaft I had selected was located several hundred yards from the main facility buildings, hidden in a depression that had been used for equipment storage during the complex's operational period. The shaft opening was covered by a metal grate that had been corroded by 30 years of weather exposure. I used specialized tools to remove the grate quietly, revealing a vertical passage that descended into absolute darkness. The descent into the abandoned mining complex was like entering a different world. The shaft dropped 40 feet through solid rock before opening into a horizontal tunnel that had been carved following a mineral vein. The walls showed the distinctive marks of industrial excavation equipment, and the air carried the stale, metallic scent of an underground environment that hadn't seen fresh circulation in decades. My first challenge was orientation. The architectural plans I had memorized showed the tunnel system as it had existed during active operations, but 30 years of abandonment had changed many of the passages. Some tunnels were partially collapsed, forcing me to find alternate routes. Others were flooded with groundwater that had accumulated in low-lying areas of the complex. But the most significant challenge was stealth. Sound carried unpredictably through the interconnected tunnel system, which meant that any noise I made could potentially alert the hostage takers to my presence. I had to move slowly and deliberately, testing each step to avoid loose rocks or unstable surfaces that could create acoustic signatures detectable throughout the complex. The navigation required constant decision-making based on real-time conditions. That couldn't have been anticipated during mission planning. When I encountered a flooded section that blocked my planned route, I had to backtrack and find an alternate passage that added nearly an hour to my underground movement time. When a partially collapsed tunnel forced me to squeeze through a gap barely wide enough for my body and equipment, I had to determine whether the passage was structurally stable enough to support my weight without triggering further collapse. 3 hours into the underground portion of my mission, I began to hear human voices echoing through the tunnel system. The acoustic properties of the mining complex carried sound in unexpected ways, making it difficult to determine the exact location and distance of the speakers. But the voices were definitely speaking a language I didn't recognize, and their tone suggested casual conversation rather than urgent activity. Moving toward the voices required abandoning the main tunnels and following maintenance passages that were significantly smaller and more challenging to navigate. These passages had been designed for equipment access rather than human movement, which meant crawling through spaces that barely accommodated my body while carrying a full equipment load. The claustrophobic conditions that would have terrorized me during my early military service now felt familiar and manageable. The confined spaces provided concealment and allowed me to approach the hostage location without detection. My heightened spatial awareness, developed through years of specialized training, enabled me to move efficiently through passages that would have challenged most operators. As I got closer to the voices, I began to distinguish individual words and phrases that indicated the speakers were the hostage takers rather than the American prisoners. They were discussing shift schedules and guard rotations, which provided valuable intelligence about their operational security procedures. But, more importantly, Their casual conversation suggested they weren't aware of any external threat to their position. The maintenance passage I was following opened into a larger chamber that provided visual access to the main processing area where the hostages were being held. Through a gap in the rock formation, I could see 12 American civilians sitting against one wall of the chamber, guarded by 3 armed individuals who appeared relaxed but alert. The hostages looked exhausted but uninjured. They were bound with plastic restraints, but didn't appear to be experiencing immediate physical mistreatment. The guards were positioned strategically to observe all approaches to the chamber, but they weren't monitoring the maintenance passages that I had used to reach my observation position. From my concealed location, I was able to establish satellite communication with our command center using the specialized equipment I had carried through the tunnel system. The communication array functioned perfectly despite being nearly half a mile underground, establishing clear voice contact with Colonel Reyes at our operations center. "Command, this is Chen. I have visual contact with all 12 hostages. They appear uninjured but restrained. 3 guards visible in the immediate area, with unknown additional personnel in other parts of the complex." "Outstanding, Chen. Can you assess the feasibility of direct rescue extraction?" I studied the chamber layout and the positioning of the guards. Negative on direct extraction. The chamber has only one accessible entrance, which is under constant observation. Any rescue attempt would require neutralizing the guards simultaneously while preventing them from harming the hostages. "What about establishing direct communication with the hostages?" "Possible, but risky. I can reach a position where I could make contact with the prisoners, but it would require moving through areas where guard detection is likely. The next phase of the operation required careful coordination between my underground position and the command center's tactical planning. While I maintained observation of the hostage situation, the command center was coordinating with local military forces and negotiation specialists to develop a comprehensive response strategy. "Chen, we're going to attempt negotiation with the hostage takers while you maintain your position as a contingency option. If negotiations fail, we may need you to either facilitate rescue operations or provide real-time intelligence about changing conditions in the complex." Over the next 6 hours, I remained hidden in the maintenance passage, monitoring the hostage situation while serving as the command center's primary source of intelligence about activities in the underground portions of the complex. I observed guard rotation schedules, noted changes in the hostage's condition, and tracked movement patterns that could affect potential rescue operations. The negotiation process was slow and complicated by the fact that the hostage takers had chosen their underground location specifically to avoid conventional military response. They believed their position was impregnable, which made them confident in their demands, but also resistant to compromise. But as the negotiations continued, I began to notice changes in the guards' behavior that suggested increasing tension within their organization. Conversations became more heated, and I observed disagreements about how to proceed with their operation. Some guards appeared to favor accepting negotiation offers, while others insisted on maintaining their original demands. "Command, I'm observing internal conflict among the hostage takers. Their unity appears to be deteriorating as negotiations continue. Can you assess whether that creates opportunities for intervention?" "Possibly. If the internal disagreements escalate, it might create moments when guard attention is divided or when individual guards are isolated from mutual support." The opportunity I had been waiting for developed during the 18th hour of my underground observation. 2 of the 3 guards left the main chamber to participate in what appeared to be a heated argument with other members of their organization in a different part of the complex. This left only 1 guard watching the 12 hostages, creating a brief window for potential intervention. "Command, single guard remaining with the hostages. Request permission to attempt prisoner contact." "Chen, that's extremely risky. If you're detected, it compromises the entire operation. Understood. But this may be our best opportunity to gather intelligence directly from the hostages about the hostage-takers' plans and capabilities. After receiving authorization, I moved from my concealed observation position to a location where I could make direct but quiet contact with the American prisoners. The approach required crawling through a maintenance tunnel that brought me within 15 feet of the hostages, but remained hidden from the guards' line of sight. Using hand signals and whispered communication, I was able to make contact with Dr. Sarah Mitchell, one of the captured contractors who had positioned herself near the edge of the group. Through careful questioning, I learned critical information about the hostage-takers' organization, their planned timeline, and their internal disagreements about how to conclude the operation. "There are 11 of them total," Dr. Mitchell whispered. "They're planning to move us tomorrow night to a different location. Some of them want to accept the negotiation offers, but their leader insists on full payment of their demands. Are any of you injured or in immediate medical danger? Johnson has a heart condition and hasn't had his medication for 2 days. He's stable now, but he won't last much longer without treatment." This medical information created new urgency for the operation. Even if negotiations eventually succeeded, the delay required to reach agreement might result in a medical emergency that could be fatal for one of the hostages. "Command, medical situation developing among the hostages. We have a cardiac patient who needs medication within the next 24 hours. Chen, can you provide emergency medical support from your position?" "Negative. I'm carrying basic emergency supplies, but nothing appropriate for cardiac medication. The patient needs evacuation to proper medical facilities." The deteriorating medical situation forced a change in the overall operational strategy. Instead of continuing negotiations while hoping for peaceful resolution, the command center began coordinating a rescue operation that would use my underground position to facilitate simultaneous intervention from multiple directions. "Chen, we're shifting to active rescue mode. Local military forces will create diversions at the main facility entrances to draw the hostage-takers' attention, while you guide rescue teams through the tunnel system to reach the hostage location." "How many personnel will be entering the tunnel system?" 8-person rescue team, all trained in confined space operations. Your job will be to guide them through the route you use to reach your current position and coordinate the timing of the rescue with surface diversions. The rescue operation that followed was the most complex underground coordination I had ever participated in. While surface forces created multiple diversions designed to draw the hostage-takers away from the underground chamber, I guided the rescue team through the maze of passages that led to the hostage location. The rescue team's movement through the tunnel system required careful timing and communication to avoid detection while positioning them for simultaneous intervention. I served as the advance coordinator, moving ahead of the team to identify obstacles and ensure that the route remained passable for multiple personnel carrying full combat equipment. When we reached the final approach to the hostage chamber, the coordination became even more critical. The rescue team had to position themselves to neutralize the remaining guards while preventing any harm to the hostages. My role was to provide real-time intelligence about guard positions and movements, while serving as communication relay between the rescue team and the surface diversion forces. The actual rescue operation lasted less than 3 minutes. When surface diversion successfully drew most of the hostage-takers away from the underground chamber, the rescue team moved simultaneously from multiple positions to secure the area and evacuate the prisoners. The precision and timing were flawless, resulting in the safe recovery of all 12 hostages without casualties on either side. But the extraction process was where my specialized training proved most valuable. Evacuating 12 weakened civilians and 1 cardiac patient through the complex tunnel system required careful planning and individual assistance for each person. Many of the hostages had never experienced underground environments and needed Psychological support to manage the confined spaces required for evacuation. I spent the next 4 hours guiding small groups of hostages through the tunnel system, providing both technical navigation assistance and psychological support for people who were experiencing severe claustrophobic reactions to the underground environment. The same spatial awareness and confined space comfort that had taken me years to develop proved essential for helping others navigate conditions that would have been impossible for them to handle alone. The final phase of the extraction involved assisting the cardiac patient, who required medical monitoring and careful movement through the most challenging portions of the tunnel system. Using emergency medical procedures adapted for confined space environments, I was able to provide stabilization support while guiding him through passages that tested the limits of what someone in his condition could endure. When we finally emerged from the mining complex 8 hours after the rescue operation began, I had guided 12 civilians and 8 rescue team members through underground conditions that most people couldn't have imagined, much less navigated successfully. The operation had been completed without casualties and with minimal detection by the remaining hostage takers. The debriefing that followed took place over several days and involved personnel from multiple agencies and military organizations. My role in the operation was analyzed in detail, not just for immediate after-action reporting, but as a case study for future underground operations involving civilian evacuation from hostile environments. Chen, your performance during this operation demonstrates capabilities that we've been trying to develop in other personnel for years, Colonel Reyes said during the formal debriefing. The combination of technical navigation skills, communication coordination, and psychological support for untrained personnel in underground environments is exactly what we need for operations in increasingly complex global situations. Ma'am. The success of the operation was due to comprehensive team coordination. My role was just one component of a much larger effort. Perhaps, but it was a component that no one else could have provided. Your ability to function effectively in underground environments, while providing support for others who couldn't handle those conditions, was essential to the mission's success. The months following the mining complex operation brought recognition that extended far beyond the Underground Operations Division. I received commendations from multiple branches of the military and intelligence community, not just for the technical success of the mission, but for developing new approaches to underground operations that could be applied to similar situations worldwide. But the most meaningful recognition came from Dr. Sarah Mitchell and the other civilians, whose lives had been saved during the rescue operation. They understood better than anyone else what it meant to be guided through underground conditions by someone who could transform potentially terrifying environments into manageable challenges. Sergeant Chen, I want you to know that your calm presence in those tunnels made the difference between panic and survival for most of us, Dr. Mitchell said when she visited our facility several months after the operation. You didn't just navigate. Those passages you helped us discover that we were capable of more than we thought possible. Her words crystallized something I had been learning throughout my journey from claustrophobic analyst to underground operations specialist. The transformation hadn't just been about overcoming personal limitations or developing technical skills. It had been about discovering that some of our greatest challenges contained the potential for some of our most valuable contributions. The claustrophobia that had nearly ended my military career had evolved into specialized capabilities that enabled me to save lives in situations where conventional approaches were impossible. The anxiety that had made me feel weak and limited had become the foundation for skills that were needed in critical operations around the world. 5 years after my first panic attack in Bunker Complex Delta 7, I was promoted to Master Sergeant and assigned to lead the underground operations division's training program for new specialists. My job was to identify and develop personnel who could function effectively in underground environments while providing support for others who needed assistance in those conditions. The training program I developed emphasized not just technical skills, but psychological resilience and the ability to transform environmental challenges into operational advantages. We learned to recognize that apparent weaknesses might actually be specialized sensitivities that could become valuable capabilities when approached with the right perspective and sufficient training. But perhaps most importantly, we learned that some of the most critical missions require people who can go where others cannot, do what others cannot do, and provide support for others who find themselves in situations beyond their normal capabilities. The Underground Operations Division had become a home for people who had discovered that their most challenging personal experiences could become their most valuable professional assets. Standing in the training facility where I now taught others to transform claustrophobic responses into underground operational capabilities, I often thought about the analyst who had nearly passed out during routine bunker orientation. That person hadn't been weak or incapable. She had simply been someone whose particular combination of abilities and sensitivities hadn't yet found the right application. The journey from surface monitoring duty to leading underground rescue operations had taught me that our most significant limitations often contain the seeds of our most important contributions. The key is recognizing when something that appears to be holding us back might actually be preparing us for challenges we haven't yet encountered. Today, when new trainees experience their first panic attacks in confined spaces, I share with them the same lesson that transformed my career and my life. Claustrophobia isn't necessarily a weakness to overcome. Sometimes it's exceptional environmental awareness waiting for the right mission to emerge. And when that mission comes, the person who seemed least capable of handling underground challenges might become exactly the specialist that situation requires. The woman who had been too claustrophobic for bunkers had become the expert they called when underground operations demanded someone who could handle what others couldn't imagine. And in that transformation, I had learned that our greatest challenges often prepare us for our most important opportunities to serve. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.